Oh, hello.
Hello. Shakmaisky, good morning, everyone. It is my honor to introduce the next session, Elder Stories. Gayle Ross, Elder and Knowledge Keeper, and citizen of the Cherokee Nation, will be leading this session. I'm looking forward to hearing some stories. I'll let you take it away, Gayle.
Thank you, Corbin, and thank you, Laura, for inviting me to be here today. It feels sort of funny to be introduced as an elder. I'm old, certainly I'm old, but I don't know, I'm just not one. There's so many other people that I look up to as elders. So I'm getting old, but basically what I am is a storyteller. I began telling stories as performance art over 40 years ago. And I was young and I made a lot of mistakes, but I grew up in a family where most of what I learned was family stories. My father grew up all over the country. My grandmother was born and raised right here in Cherokee County. But my dad, his father, my grandfather, was in the military. And so they moved all around the world while Dad was growing up. And then after World War II, he settled in Texas and married my mother, who is not Cherokee. And I grew up in what my Cherokee relatives like to call Baja, Oklahoma, which is, of course, Texas. My grandmother was the family storyteller and the family historian. She lived with my family when I was young, and she was the authority in the family. Whenever they had a question about history or our ancestors, grandmother was always the one that looked to. She was the youngest of 9 children, born to Chief John Ross's grandson, Robert Bruce, and a Cherokee woman named Fanny Daniels Thornton. And her father, of course, knew Chief Ross, knew his grandfather. He was born after the Trail of Tears, but he served in the Indian Home Guard in the Civil War, married Miss Fanny when the war was over, and she had her first child in 1869, and my grandmother was the last in 1892. So look at those years of childbearing and tell me that she was a strong woman. And because my grandmother was the last one, her father, if you see a picture of them, you would think they are grandfather and granddaughter rather than father and daughter. And Robert Bruce had turned over the running of the family farm to one of his older sons. And so he had a lot of time to spend with my grandmother. So she grew up knowing people who had survived the Trail of Tears, knowing about her great grandfather, Principal Chief John Ross. And so I was very lucky when I was growing up. Most of the stories I knew were family stories, stories about the trail, stories about Chief Ross's son, Alan, and their firstborn daughter, who died on the trail. And of course, Chief Ross's wife, Coity, died on the trail. She's buried in Little Rock, Arkansas. And as I grew older, I was just the kid on the campout who could tell you why the North Star stands still, or the kid at the somber party who knew the best ghost stories. But beginning in 1979, with a friend of mine from the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky. I actually began traveling and telling these stories. I go to schools, libraries, festivals, powwows, theaters, museums, anywhere that someone wants me to be, I'm probably going to be able to be there. And I was really enthralled listening to Daniel because it is all about relationships. When I would visit with kids or even adults at a theater performance or a museum, it was always important to me that what the stories show are our relationships. Everybody spoke the same language in the beginning days. Everybody was related. And of course, our stories tell us a lot about our relatives, some good, some bad. But I want to start with a story that is a story I've been telling as long as I can remember. It explains the Cherokee. We have an origin story that centers us in the Smoky Mountains, where we were before the trail, and we have legends that tell of a time when we originally came from some islands east of South America, and the way that we lost our home there and traveled in great canoes to the east coast of South America, and then migrated up all the way to the glaciers. And we turned east, and the story says we lived for a time with the Iroquois Confederacy before making our way down into the Smoky Mountains. And I personally think both of them are true. I see no reason to choose between the two. But this is the story of how the great gift of fire came to the Cherokee people. You know, they said in the very beginning days of the world, everything was water. Nothing here but a great ocean, and all creatures that lived in the world above. But it was becoming crowded in the upper world. And Unleiflen, a creator, said that he would make a middle world. And all the creatures in the world above, they were so happy that creator was going to make a new home for them. And the birds began to fly. Every day, a different bird would come down from the world above, fly in all four directions across the water, and one by one, they would return to say, no, there's no place there. And finally, the little water beetle flew down from the world above and flew in all four directions. But he was so small when he had flown in all four directions and there was nothing but water, he rested for a time, just floating on top of the water. And an idea came to him. He said, I wonder what's underneath the water. So that little water spider, he swam all the way to the bottom of the ocean and brought back one tiny little handful of mud, and he set it floating on top of the water. And then he flew back to the world above. And they say that tiny handful of mud that water beetle carried stretched and grew until it became this continent that we walk upon. But the earth was still soft, soft mud. And so once again, the birds began to fly. Every day, a different bird would fly down and go across the land in all four directions, and one by one they would return and say, no, the earth is still too soft. And then it was Buzzard's turn to fly. And when Buzzard had flown in all four directions and found the earth was still soft, he grew angry and impatient. He began to fly very close to the earth, making a wind with his wings that dried the land. And where his wings rose, tall mountains grew. And where his wings struck the earth, there the valleys were carved. And when he was through, and when he had gone back to the world above, he had created the beautiful mountains that were our home. And so then all creatures came down to make a home in this world. And it was a good world. The people went to grandmother's son and they asked her if she would bring her light from the world above to this new home in the middle world. And she agreed. And every day she walks a path across the heavens to bring her light and warmth to her grandchildren. Uncle Moon, he smiled in the night sky, and all the stars, everything was beautiful, but it was still a cold and dark world because there was no fire. Now lightning struck a hollow tree on an island in the middle of a great lake, and the first fire was kindled there in that hollow tree. And the smoke rose into the sky, and all our animal brothers and sisters, the birds, all creatures, they came to the shore of that lake, and they began to argue about who could bring the fire. And finally, the people said, Bear. Bear's the strongest. Bear can bring the fire. So Bear swam over to the island, and he saw a great split in that hollow tree. And he thought, well, the fire's on the inside. So he climbed into that tree where the fire was burning bright and hot. And before he could back out of that tree, he had been burned black from the tip of his nose to the tip of his tail. Sometimes you see him walking along upright like a two-legged, and then he'll give these funny rumbling little coughs. He's still trying to clear all that smoke out of his lungs. And next the people said, the wisest should go, and that's Grandmother Owl. Now, she had learned from Bear. She flew to the top of the tree and looked down, and a gust of ash and smoke blew up through that tree like it was a chimney. And the ashes burned Grandmother's eyes and made great white rings on her face. So she too came back without the fire. And when you see her today, she still wears those white rings. Now, many different people tried and failed. And then they heard one tiny little voice. It was the little water spider. And everyone laughed at her because she was so small. But Bear said, she may be small, but her heart is big. Let her go. So the water spider danced across the top of the water to that island. She didn't rush in like the others had done. She sat down outside that tree and she began to spin her web thread around and around and around until she had made a little bowl. She took mud and she lined that little bowl. And reaching in, she took one tiny little coal of fire, placed it in the bowl on her back, and danced back to the people. And they say that from that tiny coal of fire that Grandmother Spider carried on that day were all 7 sacred fires of the Cherokee people lit. Now, in the time before the Europeans came, they say that sacred fire was burning in the 7 Cherokee peace towns, and that every year at Green Corn Dance time, when the world is made new, the hearth would be swept clean, but the new fire would be lit with coals of the sacred fire from the year before. And that they say in that time of great trouble that there were those who carried coals of the sacred fire on the Trail of Tears, and that the fires that burn now at our ceremonial grounds is that living fire that's been handed down from one generation to the next, as long as there have been Cherokee people. And if you look, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the water spider on her back. She has a circle that's left from the bowl that she carried. And we look at her and we remember that the great life-giving gift of fire came to us not from the biggest or the strongest or the smartest or the bravest, but from one of the smallest and gentlest of our animal brothers and sisters. Wanda. If anybody, Corbin, if anybody has a question or anything, you can hop in between stories if you like, if there's something that anybody would like to know. That story is, it doesn't really tell as much about some of the powers that Cherokee people have a relationship in the world. Lightning, yes, lightning struck the tree, but one of the most important people in our early world, and yes, in the world today for everybody, is thunder. And thunder, well, thunder lives in the west, controls the wind and the rain and the lightning. But they say that in the early days, thunder would take on a human appearance as a man, and he would visit in Cherokee country. He considered Cherokees a special friend, and this story will tell you why. Back in those beginning days, there were 2 young boys. Now, today, you might say that they are cousins because their mothers were sisters, but in our clan way, that would make them brothers. And they were very close in age, and from the time that they were small, they were best friends. They grew up together. When they got old enough to get their first weapons, they were given the blowguns that the Cherokee people make and the little darts. And they would go out and they would hunt squirrels and rabbits. And they learned very quickly how to hunt with those blowguns. They were very good at it. Their mothers made them feel so special when they brought home a squirrel for the pot or a rabbit. But one day, when those boys were out hunting, they were climbing down a ravine to a creek at the bottom below, and they came to a place where there was a great stone porch with a hole in the back. And the boys thought, ah, that's a cave. We should look and see what's in that cave. And so they stopped on that stone porch and started toward the cave when a beautiful little brightly colored snake slid out of the cave, coiled up, raised his head, and spoke to the brothers. The snake said, boys, boys, you see how little I am? I cannot hunt for myself, but you boys are good hunters. Could you maybe bring me something to eat? A bird? A squirrel? I would be so grateful. Well, the boys were enchanted. He was such a beautiful little snake, all bright colors. And so they went and they brought back 2 squirrels for that little snake. And the snake said, Wado, little brothers, we will always be friends when you feed me. And that was the beginning of the journey of those 2 brothers. Every day they went out and they hunted and they took their kills to that ravine and the stone porch in front of that cave, and the little snake would come out of the cave, coil himself up, and speak to the boys while he ate the food that they brought him. Now, the boys didn't tell anyone. They had made a pact that they would keep their special friend a secret. Maybe their mothers wouldn't want to hear that they were spending time with a snake and could possibly be in danger. But the brothers, they told each other, he's so small. He's our friend. He would never hurt us. And so they kept on bringing food to that little snake. Even when the time came that they put away the blowguns of childhood and began hunting with bows and arrows like the men. One day, when they went to the stone porch and called to the snake, he came slithering out of that cave, and suddenly the boys, they saw him as if it were the first time. They hadn't realized how big he had gotten. And now he had a crystal on his forehead and horns on his head. And the boys, they were a little frightened. They said, you're so big. You're so big now. You can surely hunt for yourself. We really should be taking home the animals that we kill to our mothers so that she can feed the family. But the snake said, boys, boys, you promised you would always be my friend. And I told you that I would be your friend as long as you feed me. Well, after that day, without even mentioning it to one another, the boys began taking different routes to hunt. They had not gone back to that cave for a long time. And then one day, they found themselves at the top of that ravine. And suddenly they heard crashes and a man's voice screaming and more explosions. And they looked over the edge of the ravine, and there on that stone porch in front of the cave, they saw their snake. And he was coiled around the body of a man. And every time the snake squeezed the man, an explosion happened. And the man began to call to the boys, 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 I am thunder. You see this snake? It's not just a snake. It's the great Ooctane, the Cherokee dragon. And the boys looking down, they realized for the first time that, yes, this was the Ooctane, whose tales had terrified them from when they were small. But the Ooctane called to them, boys, we have always been friends. This is thunder that I have in my coils. You remember how frightened you were of his thunder when you were small? He is no friend to the Cherokee. Let me kill him. And Thunder said, boys, boys, think. I am thunder. Look on the Ooctane's body. You see those spots? If you will shoot your arrows at the 7th spot, you can kill this dragon and save my life. And the boys, they were confused. They had been friends with this snake and he had never harmed them. But thunder had frightened them as well so many times. But suddenly the boys, they thought about what their mother had told them when they were frightened by the thunder and the storm. Don't worry. Thunder is a friend to the Cherokee people. Without thunder, we would have no rain. And without rain, we would have no crops. And so the boys knew what they had to do. Very carefully, they both aimed their arrows at the 7th spot on the Ooctane's body, and they flew straight and true and pierced that Ooctane in the place where he had hidden his heart, underneath that 7th spot. There was a great howling sound in the air, and suddenly from the Ooctane's body, as it fell into coils, a great cloud of smoke rose. And the man that had been captured by the Ooctane, Thunder, he called, boys, run, run, this smoke is poison. And so they ran as fast as they could. And Thunder sent lightning to strike a tree and made a fire. And where that fire touched the smoke, it disappeared. And the boys kept running, and all the time behind them, they could see that smoke coming closer. And once again, thunder would start a fire that burned away. And finally, after the 7th time that thunder had started a fire, the last of that poison was burned away from the air, and a gentle rain began to fall. Thunder, he spoke to the boys and said, "You two are the reason that thunder will always be a friend to the Cherokee people." And then he headed back to his home in the West. And the boys, they walked home together, and they realized that they had saved not only their own lives, but the lives of all the people by remembering what their mothers had told them. What a I'm going to tell a story. I don't know if Daniel has left, but this is a very special story to me. Many of the stories I tell, I have learned from other Cherokee stories or collections or other Cherokee people. But this one was taught to me and given to me by a man who was, I was just privileged to know him in the same way that I felt privileged to have known Vine Deloria. Benny Smith was Redbird Smith's grandson. Redbird was the one who revitalized the ceremonial grounds at the turn of the century when we were going through allotment. And this is a story that Benny told. And Benny was not only important at the grounds, but his whole life was education. He worked at Haskell for years and years and years. And I'm sorry to say he's gone now, but this is the story that Benny taught me. Long time ago, there were 3 brothers. Now, their father had died, and their mother, she had no brothers, so they did not have an uncle to take over their raising. But their mother was a beloved woman, strong and fearless, and she had a great deal of knowledge. She was loved and respected in the village where they lived. But in spite of that, there came a time when the oldest brother, he grew impatient with the life of his small village. He wanted to go out and see what there was to see in the world. So he went with his brothers to water in the morning. All good Cherokees go to water when the sun rises. And he told his brothers, he said, "Today I am going on a journey. I'm going to go and see what I can see and learn what there is to learn. Now, if I do not come back, come to water when I've been gone a year, and if your nose bleeds, you will know that I'm in trouble and you need to come and help me." And the 2 younger brothers agreed. So they went back to their home, and the oldest boy said, "Mother, make for me the toasted brown cornmeal, that traveling food I am going on a journey and I'm going to leave today. And the boy's mother said, I think a journey would be a good thing for you to do, but wait, don't leave yet. Stay one more night with me and we will talk in the AC, in the hothouse. There are things I would tell you. And then you can go to water in the morning and then you can leave. But the oldest boy was impatient. No, mother, he said, make that brown cornmeal. I want to leave right now. And so his mother made that toasted brown cornmeal, that traveling food. And she filled a leather pouch with the cornmeal. And the oldest boy said goodbye to his mother and his two younger brothers, and he went off to see the world. But he hadn't really gone very far away from his village, and he saw beside the path ahead of him an old man sitting on the ground beside the path. And when the boy came closer, the old man called to him, grandson, grandson, do you have any food? I'm so hungry. But the oldest brother said, I have the brown cornmeal my mother made for me, but it is for my journey. I do not know how long I will be gone. I really need to keep it for my journey. And the old man said, go in peace. And so the boy continued down that trail. And when the sun was going down and the shadows were coming up among the trees of the forest, away in front of him, the boy saw a great bonfire burning. And he headed for that fire, and he saw that the fire burned in the yard of a house with a fence around it, and standing at the gate was the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen. She called to him, come in. I will cook for you. I will feed you. And you can spend the night here and go on your journey tomorrow. And the boy was so dazzled by her beauty that he didn't hesitate. He walked right through that gate. And the woman handed him a smooth, shiny pebble. She said, put this in your medicine pouch. And the boy did. He went into the house with that woman. And she cooked for him and he ate her food. And he spent the night in her house. But when he woke up in the morning, there was no beautiful young woman. There was a woman whose face was twisted and contorted by hate and rage, and the boy was frightened. He ran for the door, and she called, stay, eat with me. But the boy didn't listen. He just ran down the path through the yard, and then as he reached the gate, there was a great pop from inside his medicine pouch, and the boy fell to the ground lifeless. And the woman gathered up his body, took him into her house, and laid him in a great wooden box and closed the lid. So that boy's journey ended not very far from his home at all. Now a year passed, and the two remaining brothers, they went to water, and as they dashed the water in their face, their noses began to bleed, and they looked down at the blood drops in the water, turning the water red, and they knew that their brother was in trouble. So they went back home to their mother, and the second oldest boy said, "Our brother is in trouble. I must go. I must find him. I must help him." And the mother said, "Stay one more night. I would like to spend the night talking in the OC. There are things I would teach you." But the second brother, like his older brother, he was impatient. "I'm going to leave now. Make for me the brown cornmeal." And so their mother did. And the second brother set out along that same path that his older brother had walked. And like his older brother, he saw an old man sitting beside the trail. And as he came closer, the old man called to him and said, "Grandson, do you have any food? I'm so hungry." But the second brother, he said, "I have the brown cornmeal, that traveling food that my mother made for me, but I'm on my way to help my oldest brother. He's in trouble and he needs my help. I don't know how long I will have to make that food last. I need to keep it for myself." And so the old man said, "Go in peace." And like his older brother, he came to that bonfire in the yard of that house, and standing at the gate was the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen. She called to him, "Come in, come in, I will cook for you. You can eat with me and stay in my house and go on with your journey in the morning." And that boy too was so dazzled by her beauty that he didn't hesitate to go through that gate and into her yard. And she handed him a beautiful, shiny, smooth stone. She said, "Put that in your medicine pouch." And the boy did. And she cooked for him, and he ate her food. And like his brother, he spent the night in her house. And in the morning, when he woke up, there was no beautiful young woman. There was a woman whose face was twisted with rage and hate. And he was frightened and ran from that house. But when he reached the gate, there was a great pop from his medicine pouch, and he too dropped lifeless to the ground. And that woman gathered him up, put him in that wooden box with his brother, and closed the lid. Now a year passed, and the youngest brother went to water. And when he splashed his face, the blood began to flow. And he went back to the house and told his mother what had happened, and that he would need to go and find his brothers. And she said, "Stay. I would teach you some things you need to know before you go." And so the youngest brother said, "Mother, I would like to hear anything that you have to teach me. And so the mother and the youngest boy spent the night in the hot house, and she told him many things about how to be a good man. And in the morning, she made that brown cornmeal. And the youngest brother set off on the same path his two older brothers had walked. And he too came to the place where an old man sat beside the road. The old man said, "Grandson, have you any food? I am so hungry." And the boy said, "I have brown cornmeal that my mother made. Let us eat together and we can talk." And so the youngest brother shared his brown cornmeal with the old man. And the old man told him what had happened to his brothers and said, "Let me give you something to help yourself with." And she gave him a small wooden whistle. And he taught the boy how to puff, puff, puff the air through the whistle. And he said, "You will know when it's time." And so the youngest brother went on down that path, and he too came to that place where fire was burning in the yard of the house with the fence, and the young woman standing at the gate saying, "Come in, I'll cook for you." And the youngest brother walked through that gate. She handed him that small, smooth stone and said, "Put that in your medicine pack." And the boy reached toward his side, but when the woman turned her head, he tossed that stone into the air, and there was a great pop. And the woman said, "What was that?" And the boy said, I think a tree branch fell." And they went into the house, but the boy would not eat her food. He ate only the brown cornmeal his mother had made. And in the morning, when he got ready to go, there was the woman, her face contorted with rage and hate, screaming at him, "Stay, stay and eat with me." And the boy walked out into the yard, and glancing over his shoulder, he saw that woman running for him with a great knife in her hands. And the boy took out the whistle and puffed it 4 times, and out of the air came an eagle, a lion, a bear, and an wolfgang, and they fell on that woman and ripped her to pieces. And the boy called, "It is enough." And the 4 beings went back into the air. And the boy went into that house and opened that wooden box. And when the woman had died, his brothers were restored to life. And he told them, "Go home. Our mother has missed you so badly. This time, sit with her and listen to what she has to teach you." And so the 2 older brothers went back home. The youngest brother, though, he continued on his journey to see what he could see and learn what there was to learn. And the good that he did in the lives of the people he met, well, that would take more stories to tell than we have time to hear them. Wado. Hey guys, who's out there? Any questions? Any comments?
Thank you
I
so
don't,
much, Gail. That was
oh,
awesome.
my pleasure. I'm so glad to see everybody.
Yes.
Fine.
Any questions? Go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. And awesome. There's some comments here. I'll just share with you. Steph Colty said, "I love listening to your stories." Joanna said, "Wonderful, thank you." Leah White said, "Thank you, Gail, for sharing these wonderful stories and your great gift of telling them." Tally said, "I have no questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing these beautiful stories. They've really touched my heart."
Gail, I wanted to also share my appreciation for your amazing storytelling and your time and
Oh, I'm so excited to have been invited. I really love being included.
I have one question for you from myself, and I can't type in the chat to ask them where people can see it. So, what do you do to make sure that the stories that are sacred remain in your communities versus the stories that you bring into public forums like this today?
That's an important question, actually, and one that I think every storyteller needs to ask themselves. And what it really boils down to is what Daniel said about relationship. Do you have a relationship with your community so that you know what what's expected of you, that you're not commercializing or misusing the stories? I mean, it's a fine line. It's a fine line you have to walk if you make your living as a performer. And I've always wanted to share these stories for the same reason that Daniel was talking about. They teach relationships. And if we don't get our act together and understand what our relationships are and how we must take responsibility for our walk in the world, we're going to be in big trouble. I remember when I started telling stories and I'd see kids in school and I'd always, they'd laugh at the rabbit stories and jump at a spooky story, but I always tried to tell them, you guys are going to have a world that you're going to grow into where you will be facing all of the devastation that, I mean, my generation, we thought we would be the one to fix it. And I was in the 7th grade the first time a teacher in our local schools took us on a field trip out into the woods and started talking about ecology and the way things are interrelated. And so, yeah, when the time came and we were marching for civil rights and when the AIM protests were happening for Indian rights, we thought we would be, I never dreamed I would be this old and having to fight like all over again, for some of our basic human rights. And to me, the stories are the best way to teach that about relationships. But you're right. If Benny had not, that story comes from the grounds. That's where I knew Benny from, is from the Smith grounds. And if Benny had not told me to tell this story, I would not. If he had told it to me just as, in the course of spending time at the grounds and listening to people, then I would carry that story with me everywhere, but I would not share it in public. But Benny, it was important to Benny. There were a couple of different stories that he taught me and he used to say, and you're a storyteller, put your own heart into it. You know, if you see a way of telling it differently that feels right to you, that's been the process, as long as there have been Cherokees stories and Cherokees to listen to them. So I kind of take my guidance from, are the stories, were they put into a collection, were they intended to be shared? And you got to be careful and trust. You know, you got to know enough about your source to know whether they're trustworthy. And the same for people. You know, if people like Benny um, taught me that story and wanted me to share it, I'm thrilled and honored beyond measure to carry that story forward. I wish Benny was still here. I miss him a lot. I know a lot of other people do too.
Awesome. I have a few other comments and then a final question for you. Emily Clark said, "Thank you for sharing these stories. What an amazing experience." Kelsey said, "Thank you, Gayle. Much appreciated." And I apologize if I say this name wrong. I apologize ahead of time, but Way Kirchner said, "I feel honored to have been able to learn from you today. Thank you." An anonymous attendee said, "Thank you for your beautiful storytelling, Gayle. I am soon to be mother to a little boy, so these stories to the wisdom of your mother feels very close to home right now."
Aw.
And then Yvonne Fish asked a question, "Amazing. When did you begin telling stories?"
Well, like I said, from the time I was a kid, I just loved stories, and I read everything. I was a voracious reader. My town librarian and my school librarian loved me because I was in their library all the time and asking for more and more books. And then, of course, I grew up, but like I said, I grew up in Texas, away from the larger Cherokee community. Um, in fact, when the first time I got to know an Indian community that wasn't my family, my dad's side of the family, was when I was like 18 and going to college in Dallas. And there was a sizable intertribal community in Oak Cliff around the United Indian Methodist Church. And the preacher was a Cherokee named Lindy Waters. And I got involved with that community. We held the first major city intertribal powwow when I was in college, and we all worked on that. And then I just always loved stories. And in 1979, my dear friend Elizabeth Ellis, who was a professional storyteller in her position in Dallas Public Library, she talked me into, and I was between situations at the moment. It wasn't like I was leaving. It's really great. I've been in radio and TV most of my professional life, but the station always stayed in one place, and those stories didn't often have happy endings. And when she just said, look, we can do this, because we had gone to a festival, the first national storytelling festival, and we had heard other professional tellers. And between the two of us, we talked each other into trying to, what I laughingly call, make a living performing. And like that was in 1979. And after we had been a duo for a few years, Elizabeth's children were growing up and leaving home, and she was free to travel more. And I got married and was starting my family and didn't want to travel as much. We kind of went our separate ways. And she's a very well-respected storyteller in the world of the storytelling communities. She is a National Life Achievement honoree. And one of the things that enabled me to do, though, as a solo teller, was to concentrate on community, was to reconnect with my family in Oklahoma. Wilma Mankiller used to tell a story about, she was part of urban relocation, which is how the Dallas community I was talking about, that's how they came to be. In the 50s, the BIA was talking people to moving into the cities. And Wilma grew up in San Francisco, and when she came back home, she said she was crossing the street in Stillwell, and she heard somebody say, "That's old John Mankiller's granddaughter." And she just immediately, it just went to her heart. And I've had that same experience, coming here over and over and over. And now I'm here. I live in the northern part of Cherokee County. The 14 northeasternmost counties of Oklahoma are the Cherokee Nation. They were our borders before allotment and statehood. And the Supreme Court, which, is hair lipping our governor big time, I love it. The Supreme Court in McGirt found that our reservation boundaries had never been disestablished. So we still have that an expanded jurisdiction over this part of the land here, and that's going to be really interesting watching that growth. I'm really proud. I don't know the people in the government like I used to, but I see our current tribal government doing some things that I think are really important around the language, around the culture. And they've made an incredible investment in our healthcare, in our IHS. We have a hospital, clinics all over. So, to give them their due, I don't know them well, but there are many things I think they're doing right.
Thank you so much, Gayle. Thank you also, Corbin, for facilitating and moderating the session. Gayle, you're amazing. We appreciate the stories and the lessons.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm so tickled to be here. Thank you for including me.
Thank you. I think we all have a lot to reflect on from your stories and the lessons that they have brought to us today. So we're going to transition now to our break period. There's a 1-hour break in today's schedule for people to rest and reflect and think about some of the amazing things that you've heard from people so far today. I think we have about 5 more sessions this afternoon that begin in about an hour. So I'm going to get off cam here and I'm going to put up a timer. Please come back at 1 p.m. Pacific time, or you can stay in the room and, just make sure that you're back in about an hour to listen to our next sessions. And thank you again so much, Gayle, for your time. Thank you, Corbin, Meadow. Appreciate it.
Thank you.